Like if you did this, you'd probably lose something else. If you cut down your consumption, you'll probably lose your standard of living. We shouldn't be looking at this as a zero-sum game, but in fact, as a win-win for the wider economy and the natural ecosystems. And just before I start going through these slides, I just wanted to quickly reflect on what the previous speaker, Letitia, mentioned. There's one point which was quite striking, which was to not look at this problem as a zero-sum game, i.e. family planning isn't necessarily a loss of something else, but if you look at it in the context of a key measure towards sustainable development, then it's sort of a win-win. And part of building a resilient economy is to look at ideas, notions that I'm going to speak about, not as a zero-sum game. So, and also sort of reflect briefly this morning. I spent an hour this morning doing the rounds of BBC local radio stations across the country, from Cumbria to Lincolnshire to Berkshire and everything else, talking about one headline that's been in the news all morning today, which is gas prices and how ridiculously high they are. And I think that is, while thinking about this presentation, what I would speak about, I thought it was apt to reflect again on what it is that we're going through. There's hardly a resilient economy that we've got here, where volatility in the international markets that we're so connected to and so reliant on means that slight changes outside, controlled by forces that are beyond our control, are really shaking up how we live here and causing income issues, driving people into fuel poverty, things of that nature. So it is, again, something to reflect that the economy that we've got today is far from resilient. So if you want to build a more resilient economy, you have to really transform from where we are today to something else, and which is what I'm going to talk about. I'm not going to read through this. This is just a quick quote from a small paper that had about 11,000 scientists and counting signed up to it. And it's essentially stating what our previous guests and speakers have spoken about as well. Like, we are very much, without a shadow of a doubt, in a climate and ecological emergency. None of you here, I believe, doubt that, but that is what we're facing. So just to reinforce that point, and what are the sort of key indicators that suggest that we are. And the way I'm going to break this presentation down, by the way, is the why of it, the why we are trying to build a resilient economy. Here's a slide with some of the indicators. Not all of you can see this clearly, but we've got a few indicators. Think of these as the vital statistics of the planet, and they're not really doing well. You've got human population, fertility rate, livestock, per capita meat production and consumption, things like carbon pricing, fossil fuel subsidies. A lot of these graphs that you see, the trend is towards a trajectory which isn't really good for the long-term health of the planet and the ecosystem. That's the short summary of this slide. The couple of key slides I want to touch upon are one on fossil fuel subsidies. Just a couple of days ago, there was a story from the IMF, in fact, yesterday, talking about how we still continue to subsidize fossil fuel and the fossil fuel industry to the order of 11, I think, how much was it? 11 million pounds a minute. That's the scale of subsidies that we offer to this industry, both from a consumption and production point of view. So if you're really talking about dealing with climate change, I suppose the first step is to stop adding fuel to the fire, which is what we tend to do here. Anyways, the point being that a lot of these indicate or give us a very strong reason as to why we need to act urgently to bring about a more resilient economy, because a lot of this is extremely unsustainable. And another key thing about building a resilient economy, we tend to ask certain questions that are absolutely incorrect in the context. One question we ask, for example, is how does climate change impact the financial system? As opposed to thinking about how does the financial system actually cause climate change, which is where we're at this point. So we need to sort of flip a few questions. It isn't just about how quickly we can cut carbon emissions, which is a key question, no doubt. Don't get me wrong there, but another important question, if not more important question, is how do we do that in a way that is fair, just, and allows everybody to sort of be brought along. It isn't just about growth, as we've seen with other speakers talking about. It isn't just about growth, but understanding the limits to that, understanding that growth needs to happen within a certain boundary, whether we like it or not, and that boundary is planet Earth and what is within this. So those elements of boundaries, are key in really understanding the definition of resiliency. Again, I'm not going to go through all the text. This is just look at the headlines. My presentation is going to break down resiliency into these 4 categories: policy, finance, business, and citizens. So taking measures along these 4 categories. This is not exhaustive. None of what I'm saying is exhaustive, but to help give my presentation a structure and talking about the work that NEF does, I thought it best to present it this way. So policy, finance, business, and citizens. And I'm going to go through the text in some of these slides one by one. So this is something that's part of a research that's come out quite recently, which I find extremely fascinating and makes a lot of key arguments when you're thinking about policy in the context of a just transition, a fair transition towards cutting carbon, building a more resilient economy. I'm going to read this out quite quickly. Factors such as public service quality, income equality, democracy, and electricity access are associated with higher need satisfaction and lower energy requirements. This might sound intuitive, but this is part of a study that I quote at the bottom, which is for the first time done a thorough empirical study looking at over 100 countries to really understand how does energy consumption overlay with need satisfaction. So what I mean by need satisfaction is food, water, sanitation, education, income, and life expectancy, which is fairly common around the world. That's precisely the kind of needs that we would have in this country, as you would expect where I come from back home in India. So if you plot a graph, you've got total final energy use, say, on the x-axis, and you've got need satisfaction on the y-axis. If you plot a graph, what you would see is your need satisfaction would go up as energy demand goes up, and at a certain point it plateaus. So after a certain stage where you've met the needs that I've just identified, adding extra energy consumption or energy demand to the economy doesn't really do much to enhance your needs further. So it speaks broadly to understanding where those limits are and working within those limits. If for instance, think about, as it says here, for countries achieving high values of what are called beneficial provision factors, so the factors such as these, public service quality, income equality, all of those things. Looking at those indicators in countries where it's high, energy demand tends to be relatively low. That is the key correlation that they've made as well. So when you reach a certain standard of needs met through these public services and other systems like democracy, income equality, energy demand as an absolute tends to be relatively low. And if you add further energy demand, you're not really doing much, as I've said, to the need satisfaction. That's a key inference from this report. Conversely, they talk about negative provisioning factors. You've got the positives, which is public services, universal access to, say, transport, democracy, things like that. You've got the opposites, which are what is called extractivism or rampant economic growth. So in those circumstances where countries are facing that in more acutely, what we see is, as it says here, beyond moderate levels of affluence are associated with lower need satisfaction. So again, take India, for example. We are growing quite rapidly over the last couple of decades. But what we've seen, of course, is without a provision of a proper safety net, without a provision of basic welfare services, you have massive inequality. The negative factor that I'm talking about, massive inequality there. And ultimately, the way to the only way forward seems to be to keep putting on more and more energy demand on the system without really thinking about how do you equalize energy needs and need satisfaction across the country. So I think that's a key inference for policy. The reason why I only talk about this, tons of other policies we can think about, is to really bring together the social policy dimension, the welfare dimension, along with the climate crisis as well. Because you can't really think about purely in terms of carbon. We need to think about carbon plus the wider social policy environment that we live in. On finance, I've just quoted this, and I said, looking at this question on finance purely from a point of view of what climate change can do to finance is insufficient, but I still quote this. This is from a recent paper from Bank for International Settlements, It's got a lot of attention because it, for the first time, goes into in-depth detail of how climate change is wreaking havoc in the financial system, or could rather wreak havoc in the financial systems moving forward. And a lot of it is to do with actual impacts of climate change and obviously the knock-on effects on the insurance industry, things of that nature. We're already seeing that play out in real time around the world, as we've seen in the examples before. The next slide on business, I found this quote quite interesting. Companies that are perceived to be fixated on profits, for example, do not engender loyalty. I suppose I'm on the sort of end of the millennial demographic, just about, but a lot of millennials, the Gen Z, are very, very keen, and they understand some of these values or value-based aspects of doing business, and they take that very seriously. Companies like Shell, for example, or BP, some of these companies are finding, in fact, they would tell you they're finding it quite difficult to actually hire young people because young people don't want to work for these businesses anymore because they're seen as the causes behind the crisis that they find themselves in. So this slide to me, I suppose, suggests that thinking about values, thinking about not just profit, but the planet, the ecological health, social health, all of that are key determinants for businesses to really actively think about and internalize in their business models, so to speak. And final thing is consumption. We've been talking about consumption a fair bit, and it seems to be a very tricky thing to obviously navigate, and understandably so, right? But this is, again, another quote that I found quite fascinating. And again, it's a provocation where Peter Singer says this could be the last generation that flaunts their wealth. I really hope that is the case, because a lot of consumption is beyond need satisfaction right now. A lot of the consumption that drives climate change and carbon emissions is beyond need satisfaction. And a lot of that is driven by status, a core aspect of capitalism, so to speak. So breaking that down, which I'm hoping we can discuss a bit more, will be quite, it's happening already organically in some way, but how do we sort of accelerate that process where status isn't really the only driving factor, keeping up with my neighbors isn't the only driving factor that is driving a lot of this luxury consumption, but getting to a level of need satisfaction across the economy equally perhaps is the more novel and noble objective for economy, for a resilient economy. How much time have I got? Yeah, I've got some time. NEF, which I haven't introduced, I should do at the end, the organization I work with, along with Zoe Foundation and Wellbeing Alliance, put together a report, a summary of which is what I'm trying to present here. And in that report, which you can go and read online, it's about a couple of hundred pages, we narrowed down about 300 policy options that we've thoroughly examined, because there's tons of ways to like cut carbon, reduce greenhouse gases and the impact on the environment. But we've used a whole bunch of criteria, which you can see at the top. I'm going to read a couple of them, just so you're aware of what I'm talking about. Does it shift profitability? Does the policy enhance sufficiency? Does the policy is the policy affordable, or rather, does it enhance affordability and fairness? These are some of the criteria that we tested. We road tested this set of policies, a whole bunch of stakeholders who understand this sector quite well, and came up with this sort of 8 policy ideas. I have to caveat the fact that this is no way exhaustive. If you're going to come up later and say, oh, you missed this, of course I missed something. This is just a short list of what we have condensed or synthesized from a policy set of 300 that we've examined, like I said, across all these criteria, and come up with these 8, which I think are worth unpacking a bit more. So very briefly, what have we got here? The first is on well-being budget, which is essentially what other speakers have spoken about as well. How do we move away from a system that measures something useful, GDP that is, no doubt about it. It does give us an indicator of health. I wouldn't trash the entire metric altogether, but it's not measuring a whole bunch of other things that are equally important, and sometimes much more important. The ecological health of our planet, of our communities is as important. So how do we think about that more actively? How do we bring that into our indicators for growth and development are quite important. There's a bill already right now in Parliament. It's a private member's bill in the UK. Unlikely that will go through. Private members will never do, but it does talk about well-being budgets being introduced in the UK Parliament. So hopefully we'll have more of a discussion on that, if we're measuring the wrong things, but it's time to sort of shift that fairly soon. Embedded within the well-being budget is what is called a precautionary principle. Some of you may be aware of that. It is ultimately, I think, one of the core principles that needs to drive policy making moving forward. That if we, I suppose, are unaware of the impacts that our actions are causing, then the best thing to actually do is not to take that action, especially in terms of ecological health, because we're in such a fragile place. Continuing the kind of development trajectory we're on is only adding fuel to the fire. I'll go through a few more. I'm not going to go through all of the 8, but perhaps pick a few interesting ones. One I've mentioned there is green credit guidance, which is slightly technical, but essentially all it talks about is we've got massive behemoths in the form of financial institutions like the central banks. And central banks have a huge role to play in essentially redirecting finance towards, away from fossil fuels, as I mentioned earlier, through subsidies, towards the right side, right parts of the economy, be it renewables, be it other forms of sustainable technologies. So right now, a lot of banks obviously borrow from central bank, but it comes with not a lot of conditions. So all we are saying, I suppose, is in the credit that the Bank of England or any other central bank, the credit that it offers to other retail banks, how do we ensure there's clear conditions of green on top of that? That's one policy. The reason why we talk about that and not about other financial policies, because hundreds of them, is because of the power that central banks have in the economy. Huge power. Just look at COVID and what has happened. The 70 billion pounds that we pumped into the economy, a large part of it was borrowed from the Bank of England, which is, again, owned by the government, right? So it is that system that is extremely powerful, and we could actually maneuver that for our needs, and we aren't doing that at this point. And the final thing, perhaps, I'd say is environmental border tax. I forget the name of the first speaker this morning, but second speaker. He spoke quite a bit about carbon pricing, and an extension of that perhaps is the environmental border tax. The idea being that, yes, we've got a carbon price in the UK, by the way, which is at an all-time high. If you follow the carbon markets, an all-time high today, and continues to go up and up and up. What we do not have is goods coming into the economy, goods coming from outside, which are perhaps made in conditions that are ecologically damaging. How do we ensure that when they're reaching our borders, that we actually put a price on them, and that price is captured and reflected in the products that we've got? It might see a lot of these. I must say there's an element of incrementality to this. So when we presented this to some of our stakeholders, the pushback was that this isn't doing enough. This doesn't feel transformative. I suppose the only challenge I would offer is going back to a quote from Hemingway, where when asked, how did you go bankrupt? He said, in 2 ways. First, gradually, then suddenly. And I think these are the gradual policies that will lead to the sudden changes that we want to see. And I think change certainly doesn't happen in a linear way. If anybody tells you that, they're clearly lying or don't know. So the non-linearity of change can only happen when we put some of these policies in place, redirect, nudge the economy in a different direction than where we are right now. And the feedback loops that we create in the process will hopefully accelerate that change much faster. In the last 2 minutes I've got, last slide. This is just an illustration of everything that I've been saying. We've got an extraction economy right now, large parts of the world. We've spoken, someone spoke earlier about, new technologies coming in, electric vehicles, battery storage, all of that. In some way, that is still part of the extractive economy. It's slightly greener part of the extractive economy, but still remains part of the extractive economy. If you're not asking wider questions about what needs is it satisfying, and how do we ensure those needs are met more fairly, equally across society, then some of these luxury emissions and some of these excessive outlier consumption could be reduced. So that's how you move from an extractive economy to a more resilient economy. We've looked at the role of central banks, private banks, looked at things like resource caps, We understand there have been enough studies out there, and I can speak to some of you after if you're interested. What would a cap on materials look like? Like how much, and researchers have done these kind of studies in terms of raw materials, both biotic and abiotic. How much material would you actually have to consume to be within planetary boundaries? So resource caps, new investment facilities, things like land value tax, which is quite interesting about redistribution. Again, another guest before spoke about redistribution of wealth. Land value tax is a great way to achieve that objective. And the role of governments, of course, through introducing legislation on well-being budgets or changing what is called fiscal frameworks. Slightly techie stuff, sorry to end on that note, but there's a lot we can do. And I hope, while sitting through the earlier presentations this morning, it did leave me like, oh my God, are we ever going to do something about this? But part of what we are trying to do at NEF, along with our partners, is to try and introduce some of these changes, which I think are quite transformative if done right, and can take us towards an economy that is not just low carbon or zero carbon, but certainly more just and fair for people around the world. So yeah, that's me. Thank you.